Shogun has now come to an end, and it was a show where I was worried about if they were going to stick the landing or not. Every episode within this show was just incredible to watch. From the establishing and developing of the plot within the first 45 minutes to a consequence and a fatal death that would often occur in the final 15, it always left you in a place where you were in shock at what you just witnessed, and it would leave us wanting more. With the ending of the final episode and knowing that there was only going to be one season, the show wasn't going to be able to replicate what it had done throughout the first 9 episodes. It needed to provide a resolution and bring an end to the story that we'd all been so invested in these past few months, and personally, I think they absolutely smashed it. So with that, let's jump into the video and discuss why Shogun has the perfect ending. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. The emotion that was present. The emotion in this episode was one that was higher than many of the others. It felt like the end was upon us, and I think a lot of that came down to the pacing and tone of this final episode. It felt like the weight of Mariko's death was clouding the episode and impacting all of the characters in completely different ways, something which then seeped into the overall feeling, which is exactly what I feel the show was going for. For example, the scene where Mariko's space was empty, where she usually sat with John and Fuji, was an emotional moment. Toranaga was thinking of the sacrifice that Mariko made. Father Martin Alvito was mourning Mariko in his own way, and even the effects that Mariko left following her death in making a deal with the church in order to let Blackthorne survive and not be killed showed that even though she was gone, she was still ever present. It felt conclusive in its approach, and I think that's why the emotions were so high throughout the entire episode. We'd grown to be so close with Mariko over the course of the 9 episodes, and this was the first one that she wasn't included in, and I feel we were all kind of mourning her along with the characters. As well as that, the dream that John had where he was holding onto her cross, crying as he left Osaka because he missed Mariko, and also the transformative mindset that he had in not viewing the people of Japan as savages like when he first arrived showed progression, and it allowed us to feel what he was feeling in that moment. When he thought of Mariko, when the 2 children asked that, it showed that John was a changed man and that his viewpoint was completely different when he first arrived in Japan all of that time ago. I even thought the fact that there was a scene where Omi and John were civil with one another and showing each other respect in this final episode, whereas when compared to before, where there was anger, hostility and threatening behaviour, it showed John and Omi's development. Plus, Toda Buntaro showing John respect and helping him pull the Erasmus too. It showed that feelings were put to the side, and John was just as much one of them now. He was no longer viewed as the barbarian, and the people there were no longer viewed as the savages. All of these moments, despite being small, subtle things, contributed to the overall feeling that the episode was going for, and it really did mark the journey that the characters went on. John and Fuji's relationship was one which evoked a lot of emotions too. You could tell that after losing Mariko, John felt lost, and Fuji gave him some of that familiarity when he was back in Ajiro. But after hearing that she was going to leave to become a nun, he really didn't want her to go. The fact that he helped her move on from the death of her husband and child, and she helped him get over the death of Mariko, and with him dropping the cross into the water, something which marked him moving on. The blend of the 2 cultures within that moment, with him saying, "A soul committed to the sea is one that lives on forever." The togetherness of them both in that moment was just beautiful. The score throughout a lot of these emotional scenes was just incredible too. The instrumentation, the feeling of the way that the music just moved with the scenes. The music climaxed when emotion was at its peak, and that was best felt in the scene where John was leaving Osaka. Or right at the end when the camera was moving around Toranaga and it just cut to black with Shogun then appearing on screen. Audio and picture worked wonders in this final episode, and it really did contribute to the emotional, conclusive feeling that it had. Yabushige's demise. Yabushige was a character that I feel we all loved to hate, or maybe hated the fact that we loved. He was a total fool, but you could just see that he was so desperate to survive, and that's all he wanted. Hence the fact that he was betraying both Ishido and Toranaga at the same time. It always felt as though his acts were relatively harmless in going against one and sharing information with the other, but with him being involved in letting the shinobi into Osaka Castle, which ultimately went on to kill Mariko, we saw that Toranaga made him commit seppuku for his involvement. I found it quite poetic that he spent all his time throughout the series trying to survive, when in reality, if he had have just picked a side and not drifted between the both of them, then he would have survived, and most likely not met the death that he so desperately wanted to avoid. I thought the scene where Yabushige was begging Blackthorne to sail to England with him was an incredibly poetic moment too. The fact that in the first episode, John was once begging Yabushige for his life and now the roles were reversed, it marked a full journey between the both of them and highlighted just how things had changed. I also thought that when Yabushige was moments away from meeting his end and when he begged Toranaga to tell him of the plan that he had, it just showed how little Toranaga had trusted him. Mariko was involved and informed, Hiromatsu read Toranaga and worked out what needed to be done, and even Nagakado received thanks from Toranaga once he died, meaning that it bought him time. Yabushige though, he was never to be trusted despite how long the pair had known each other for. However, he was vital to the plan that Toranaga had, which I think is amazing at the same time. Toranaga had to account for Yabushige's betrayal, and like he predicted, he did. So the character's core was true from the moment that the episode started and finished. There was also a few moments in the finale which tied back to earlier episodes as well, such as within his poem, he mentioned how he didn't want to be burned or buried, he wanted his body to fill the belly of a hungry dog. In episode 8 of the show, he said how he ranked cracking your head on a stone lower than being boiled, but higher than being eaten by dogs. The fact that he said to Omi that he wanted his body to be left there to be eaten by dogs, maybe it showed how he viewed himself in the end, not worthy of a burial or a ceremony, and in his own way, maybe he valued his life less than Nagakado, because at least Nagakado was loyal to his father. Plus, Toranaga also said to Yabushige, "Why tell a dead man the future?" when he asked if Toranaga was doing all of this to become Shogun. This was something which connected to the fact that Yabushige said those exact words earlier on in the season. Yabushige's arc was one that was rounded off in the most perfect way possible. He'd been loyal to Ishido, but deeply regretted it, and then once back with Toranaga, he was ordered to be killed. Yabushige did this to himself, and he was the catalyst for his own demise, every step of the way. He was just a perfectly written and performed character. The lack of a battle. As the show was building towards the finale, those that know of the real history, the story in the Clavell novel or the 80s miniseries were fully aware of the fact that the infamous Battle of Sekigahara was the very battle that brought an end to Ishida Mutsunari, which is the person that Ishido was based on, and it allowed Ieyasu Tokugawa, the individual that Toranaga was based on, to reign supreme and become shogun. Within the 80s show and the novel, the battle is almost treated as a footnote, and it isn't given lots of time and attention. Back in the 80s miniseries, there was a shot of Toranaga looking on at John Blackthorne as he was rebuilding his ship with the men that were assigned to him, and the mentioning of the Battle of Sekigahara was present. Plus, we also saw Toranaga and his men preparing for the battle, but we didn't see it at all, just like what happened in this iteration over 40 years later. I was wondering whether or not there would be some kind of void that would be left within me by not seeing the battle taking place in the FX show, considering that there were moments in this show where you could imagine it looking epic. But the fact that they chose to not include it was a really valuable and important decision, not only because it allowed it to stay true to the source material and not putting the value on the battle, but also because if they did include an episode that was solely focused on the Battle of Sekigahara, it would have taken away from the main focus and skills that the show had been centered around, Toranaga and the ability that he had to dictate and read the wind. The Battle of Sekigahara is the end. It's not necessarily the be-all and end-all and the moment that everything is building towards. Everything that we saw in this show was important, and I feel if we had a battle, it would have softened the importance of every chess move that Toranaga made. We spent the entirety of this season seeing exactly how Toranaga played those that were his enemies and those that were closest to him in order to weaken the opposition. Toranaga knew what was going to happen before it did because he could read the wind. And I feel having Lady Ochiba no Kata pulling the Heirs army out of Sekigahara in the final moment was a brilliant move that embodied the trickery that Toranaga was so masterful at. We didn't need a battle. It would have been nice to have seen one, don't get me wrong, but we sure can imagine what it would have been like. Don't get me wrong as well, I wish we had have seen what happened to Ishido because that would have been interesting seeing him getting his comeuppance, but we saw his weakened state and the fact that he was betrayed on the battlefield in that short section. So I think the lack of a battle actually went in the show's favour. The Ambiguous Conclusion. Whilst this show ended in a way that wrapped up a lot of the story that we'd been following, I also feel like there was still a lot that was left open, which was done intentionally, and I quite liked it. We saw what was going to be happening in a month's time, which was the Battle of Sekigahara, and we knew that Toranaga was going to win. So rather than the show ending at its final point where Toranaga became Shogun or where he eventually died after his long reign, we finished this show before the end, and we understood that these characters were going to be continuing in the fight that they had in standing alongside Toranaga. There's not many shows that can land that, because one would just argue that they should continue creating the show if that's the case. But with this, it just worked. The show was all about the planning and preparation, not the outcome or the product. So by it leaving us not seeing him becoming Shogun, but knowing that he will eventually go on to be, it leaves it up to our imagination on how the rest of the journey is going to go. And as well, we can also do research on the real historical figures too. I felt the same was also the case with Blackthorne too. He was only at the start of his journey in Japan. Granted, he wasn't permitted to leave because Toranaga wanted him to stay, but we finally saw him at the point of being content with being there. He was conflicted before about which culture he related to, but with him smiling up at Toranaga and being accepted by the people of Japan, he knew that he'd found the place where he now belonged, and I thought that was a great way for the character to conclude. I do genuinely believe that Shogun had the perfect ending, and not only did it have the perfect ending, but it was a pretty faultless show. It's not often that shows like this come around, it's one every few years these days, and the fact that there's not going to be a season 2, it makes it even more bittersweet. Shogun was incredible, and if they do make a prequel or something like that, I'd 100% be open to it. But with regards to this story, I think that it's done, and we just need to leave it for the perfect entity that it is. So, there you have it, why Shogun has the perfect ending. If you want to see more videos on Shogun, then click on the card in the top corner. I've been covering the entirety of the show, and I also have a few more videos that I'm working on, so be sure to stick around for them. Do you think Shogun nailed the ending? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, thanks for tuning into the video, and I'll see you in the next one.